It's Thursday, 11 o'clock. It's time for this week's watch drop. So this week, I'm in my comfort zone. I'm surrounded by a table of really interesting Calatrava style watches. And really this is a watch and a design that makes me feel really happy and warm inside. I love these watches, I really do. There's some debate about what a Calatrava is, and I think most people agree that it's a round case, simple time, maybe time and date watch from Patek Philippe. And I think sometimes Patek themselves get confused about what the Calatrava is because there are so many models that are termed Calatrava but don't really fit those characteristics. But I don't want to just focus on Patek. We have some absolutely outstanding examples from Lange, Moritz Grossmann and others. So let's dive into it. I'm going to start today back in the 50s with a really, really rare 2545. Now, this is a watch that's very familiar to me, but ever so slightly different. I love the reference 96, which is where the Calatrava began. The reference 96 is a 31mm case. It is every bit the simplistic icon that began this journey of the Calatrava for Patek. Now, the 2545 is an evolution of that design. Slightly bigger case and slightly more substantial, so you can feel it in the weight. It's absolutely a thicker, more robust case, and there's a reason for that. This was the first Calatrava that was created as a waterproof watch. Now, you wouldn't necessarily look at this and think, I'm going to go diving in it. Now, being a waterproof dress watch isn't necessarily a characteristic that you would think, that's exactly what I need in my Calatrava. But when you've got young kids and you're out and about a lot, it's nice to know that you've got a watch that isn't going to succumb to moisture ingress while you're out in the rain or you're playing in the park or whatever. And so I really like that added complication, if you like. It's a really interesting case. It's a solid case back, but rather than being one that you can prise open with a knife, this is a screw down back and it's got a really substantial case back. It's got that real weight to it. As I say, the case is slightly enlarged, but every other characteristic of this watch is akin to the 96, the reference 96. Small seconds and a beautiful sort of off-white, goldish, silverish dial and a really minimalist font type for Patek Philippe. This is an exceedingly rare watch, and some people suggest that there are only 25 or so examples in circulation. That number feels pretty low to me, but I do think it's very special, and I think if you're a collector of Calatravas, then this is definitely one that you should come and take a look at and try it on, because it's a brilliant watch. Moving on and skipping forward 10 years. Now, there's really no rhyme or reason as to why I'm selecting these watches, other than the fact that they're in this week's drop. But there's absolutely something very interesting about each of these Calatrava examples. And for this one, well, for me it was interesting because it's, I've never seen it before. A reference 3411G. The case size is actually quite large for the 1960s. It's a 35mm case. It's got white gold applied indices. It's got a center seconds, which I like. So many of the Calatrava examples that I've seen have a small seconds at 6 o'clock because that's where the 96 started. But this changes that ever so slightly and puts a central seconds complication, if you like, on it. Now, as a watch that was made in 1965, I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this watch is that old. It's so sharp, and the dial is completely flawless. I love the way that the text, the Patek Philippe text, almost looks like it's enameled. And I guess that's the way that Patek Philippe went about designing these things. I guess as this watch is not waterproof, it has a pushback case back on it. They wanted that dial to outlast the owner, you know, for these watches to last for generations. And so the method in which they made these dials really did mitigate any patination, if you like. And so you've got this really fresh looking watch that could be put out in an authorized dealer today and no one would think any the wiser. I really, really adore this watch. Personally, I think 35mm is just the right size for a modern dress watch. And I like that references like the 2545 and the reference 96 take you back to a time that makes it feel like a vintage watch. This doesn't feel like a vintage watch, but it is. It's a really cool thing, and I'm really glad that someone decided to sell it. Now I'm going to skip forward, this time to the year 2000. So that's quite a leap, 35 years. But we've got a reference 5022G. Now, this example has a white dial with printed Breguet indices and also Breguet hands to complement it. And I don't know, the combination of Breguet and Breguet just makes me quite excited in a really weird way. I haven't really said that out loud before, but I really enjoy this watch. It makes me think of Breguet, it makes me think of Cartier, but at 33 millimeters, it wears perfectly. It's a quintessential dress watch, really thin, probably thin enough to be called ultra thin, and that crisp white dial. The thing about white dials is they wear much larger than the proportions of the case might lead you to believe, and the bezel is nice and slim on this, so 33 millimeters really does wear like a 34, 35. I really want this thing actually. I am really surprised by how much I like it. I don't think it'll last long, and if it does, then I'm coming back for it because I think it's brilliant. Moving forward, only a few years this time, to the reference 5107 and the year 2003. This has a very different design aesthetic. Yes, it's a round case, but it has pointed crown guards to it, which make it feel like a slightly more utilitarian design. Now, the reason this watch has got pointed crown guards is obviously to add to the robustness. So on early examples, if you were to catch this on a door frame, for instance, there's every chance that the crown might shear off. But with a case design like this, and with a screw down crown, you've got that much more robustness and resistance to things like moisture. Now, this is also the first Calatrava we're talking about today that has a date window complication. And do I think it spoils it? Not really. I think it's quite tastefully done. Although the date disc itself is a bright white against the backdrop of the ivory that you get on this example, I think so many people want a dress watch with a date complication, and this watch does it effortlessly well in a way that's not in any way ruining the fact that this is an icon of a Calatrava from the watchmaker of watchmakers. I'm going to move away from Patek, and I'm going to look at Lange, who in many ways are right up there as the number one competitor to Patek Philippe. This is undeniably an answer to Patek's Calatrava. This is the reference 1815, reference 206.027. And it's an early 1815. These 1815s, when they were first released, were in a nice 36 millimeter case size with quite a small caliber inside. If you look at the latest 1815s, they're a much bigger case format, both in thickness and in diameter. Now, this is a really rare watch. We've recently sold an 1815 up-down that had the same case, the same blue dial. But this is the small seconds complication, so it really falls into that sort of Calatrava characteristics that I was talking about before. The thing that captures your eye on this is the depth of the blue in the blue dial. And Lange is one of those brands that doesn't just have one blue to its color palette. If you look across the early Lange ones, the 027 reference, or the later Lange ones, with the 028 reference. Those two dials in two dimensions look exactly the same, but actually when you get them in the hand and you shine them towards the light, they're completely different colors. Now, this blue is very tasteful, very sunburst aesthetic with a contrasting printed white indices and minute track around the outside. I love the use of the sword hands. I love the fact that the small seconds, though the same color of blue, is printed or created in a slightly different way that gives contrast, very subtle contrast, against the blue of the main dial. I think the 1815 is probably my favourite range within Lange. It's a really simple watch, but I think it absolutely goes head to head with the very best Calatravas from Patek. But it's undeniably Lange. Now, the last Calatrava style watch I'm going to talk about today is this Moritz Grossmann Tefnut. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that correct. And when I did a little Google, I'm told that Tefnut is the goddess of moisture, which can't be right. it must be based on something else. But all of that aside, this is a 36mm white gold, very rare piece, an edition of 15 for the Japanese market. What I love most about Moritz Grossmann, the use of this handset, which is so delicate. And I think the finishing is up there, possibly a touch better than you see in Lange, which is really saying something. Moritz Grossmann are known for using this sort of not blued hands, but purple. So that is to say that you heat the hands either a little bit more or a little bit less. I'm not sure, I'm not a watchmaker, but to the point where they are purple in the right lights. I love the fact that that color is matched almost by the indices in Roman numerals on the outside of the dial, but the case is nice and slim. It's slightly thicker than the others we've spoken about today, but it's still very much a slim, dressy watch. It really goes up against the 5022, for instance, in pretty much the same size. It's a really interesting thing. I like the offset small seconds, offset this time to 7 o'clock, which is something that you don't see very often. And then you're greeted by a movement that, well, it's breathtaking. The architecture is very different to both Lange and Patek, and you could stare at it for hours. I think the attention to detail is probably unmatched, certainly at this price range. I adore it. I think Moritz Grossmann are grossly overlooked. And I think that's a shame. But I do have hope that this brand will get much more recognition in future years because it deserves it. The quality is excellent. Yeah, I really love this watch. So that's it for Calatravas. It's been a real pleasure to go through a few of these examples from across the years. I don't think you can go wrong with any of these examples, and I really hope they all go to a good home. But we're going to talk about a couple more, and I'm going to start with one from my favourite brand, Cartier. Here we have a Tank Normale in platinum. It's from the Privé range that was released a couple of years ago. There's something about Cartier and the use of platinum, particularly when they pair it with a ruby cabochon, that works so well. They always save that metal and that cabochon for the very, very special watches. The first thing that captures your eye and your enthusiasm when you see this watch is the use of the domed crystal. It's interesting when you see a square watch with a domed crystal because it's almost like those two shapes don't work well together, but it adds to sort of intrigue and definitely draws your eye to the middle of the dial. I was at a talk with Cartier not too long ago and they talked about how very rarely do they use white gold or silvered hands on a silver dial. Typically they tend to use a blued hand in that scenario for legibility. But this is one of the few watches that they've created where you have that use of silver on silver. And although it's not going to win any points for legibility or, no one's going to go and call this a tool watch, I think it does work well. And I think it is effortlessly simple and every bit of Cartier DNA that you'd hope for in a modern case. And this one is really sharp and really, really lovely. Now, there's one last watch that I'm going to talk about this week, and it's from Rolex. This is one of the most interesting Submariners I've ever seen. Let me explain to you why I think it's so interesting. Firstly, reference 5513. I love it. It's a watch that spans decades of production, but there are so many different iterations within that, and this is a 60s example. It has a riveted bracelet, which I'm told is stretchy, but I don't want to stretch it because I don't want to break it, and I love it too much. It has a gilt dial, which, any Rolex with a gilt dial commands a premium, but this one is so lovely. I don't see any damage to the dial at all. The font is as thick and as rich as the day that it left Geneva. Next, we have pointed crown guards, PCGs, and I don't know why those are so important. I think it's only because of the rarity. They don't really add anything aesthetically. If anything, they're a square edge on a rounded case, which most people, I think, would agree doesn't quite work with the design DNA, but it's a real point of interest. And I love that they're here on this watch that has so many other interesting characteristics. The last thing, and probably the most important thing for collectors, is that this has an Underline dial. And that's to say that under the per of perpetual, you have a little line. And I I love that Rolex collectors, fanboys, go so wild for these tiny, microscopic differences in watches. But this one is a particularly rare reference because of that little subtle underline. For me, as someone who's not a Submariner aficionado, I can't even say the word, I still think that this watch, with all of those little characteristics and the differences from the standard, if you can say that, 5513 that we're used to, I think this watch just comes together as something very, very special. And on wrist, particularly with my camel hair jacket, it just goes so well. I love it. Really cool. So that's this week's drop. Over 70 watches hitting the site. And such is the quality of this week's drop, I didn't even get to touch on things like the Cartier Tortue Monopoussoir. I didn't get to talk about the Breguets. There's an ellipse here that's not this way, it's this way. There's some Lange ones with grey dials. I mean, it's fantastic. It's a really cool drop. So please hit the website, go and check it out, and I'll see you next week.